November 20th, 1944. Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands. The massive anchorage sprawled across 20 square miles of protected water, sheltering the U.S. Navy's most powerful warships between operations. Fleet oiler USS Mississinewa rode at anchor among dozens of vessels, her tanks holding 404,000 gallons of aviation gasoline and 9,000 barrels of diesel fuel. At 5:47 in the morning, as the tropical dawn broke across the Pacific, a Japanese submarine launched what would become one of World War II's most terrifying weapons, a manned torpedo piloted by a volunteer who had no intention of returning. The weapon was called Kaiten, meaning return to heaven, or the turn toward heaven. Inside a modified Type 93 long-lance torpedo, a single pilot sat cramped in a space barely larger than a coffin, peering through a tiny periscope as he guided his weapon toward the American fleet. The Mississinewa's crew had no warning, no defense, no comprehension of what was racing toward them beneath the calm morning waters. When the Kaiten struck amidships at 5:47 a.m., the explosion tore through the oiler's hull with the force of 3,000 pounds of high explosive detonating directly against thin plating designed for cargo, not combat. The fireball erupted with such violence that witnesses on ships 3 miles away felt the heat wash across their faces. Aviation gasoline ignited instantaneously, creating a conflagration that reached 500 feet into the morning sky. Burning fuel spread across the water's surface, turning the anchorage into an inferno. Sailors on nearby vessels watched in horror as men abandoned ship, many already aflame, diving into water that was itself on fire. 63 American sailors died in the initial explosion and the fires that followed. The Mississinewa burned for 30 hours before capsizing and sinking, carrying her cargo of fuel to the bottom of Ulithi's lagoon. The attack shocked American commanders who believed Ulithi was virtually impregnable. The atoll had been captured from Japan just 2 months earlier, specifically because its vast anchorage could shelter the entire Pacific Fleet while remaining beyond range of Japanese land-based aircraft. Submarine nets protected the entrances, destroyer patrols circled constantly, and aircraft conducted continuous reconnaissance. Yet somehow, a single human-guided torpedo had penetrated every defense and destroyed a major fleet auxiliary in what should have been the safest harbor in the Pacific. What the Americans didn't know was that 6 Kaitens had been launched that morning from 3 Japanese submarines, I-36, I-37, and I-47. Only one had reached its target, but that single success validated Japan's desperate new strategy. As conventional naval power evaporated under American industrial might, the Imperial Japanese Navy had turned to suicide weapons as a last resort. The Kaiten represented the underwater equivalent of the kamikaze, a weapon where the guidance system was human and success meant certain death. The weapon's development had begun in February 1944 when 2 young Japanese naval officers, Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki and Lieutenant Sekio Nishina, submitted a proposal for a manned torpedo to the Naval General Staff. Japan was losing the war catastrophically. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. American carrier task forces roamed the Pacific with impunity, and American industrial production was burying Japan under an avalanche of ships and aircraft that could never be matched. Kuroki and Nishina argued that conventional weapons had failed because they lacked the human element of targeting precision and determination. A piloted torpedo, they claimed, could achieve hit rates approaching 100% while requiring minimal resources to produce. The Naval General Staff initially rejected the proposal as barbaric. Japanese naval tradition emphasized honor in combat, not suicide. officers pointed out that the Geneva Convention prohibited weapons requiring the operator's death, though Japan had never signed the convention. More pragmatically, skeptics argued that training pilots for suicide missions wasted valuable personnel who could serve multiple times in conventional roles. But as Japan's strategic position deteriorated through spring 1944, with the loss of the Marianas and the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, desperation overcame tradition. The Kaiten project received approval in July 1944. The weapon was based on the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, itself one of the war's most formidable naval weapons. The Type 93, powered by oxygen-enriched kerosene, could travel 24 miles at 48 knots or 12 miles at 52 knots, carrying a warhead of over 1,000 pounds. Japanese engineers modified the weapon by installing a small cockpit behind the warhead, barely large enough for a pilot lying prone or sitting hunched. A tiny periscope extended above the torpedo's casing, providing the pilot's only view of his target. Rudimentary controls allowed adjustment of course and depth. The warhead was increased to 3,000 pounds of high explosive, and the range extended through additional fuel capacity. The result was a weapon measuring 48 feet long and 4 feet in diameter, displacing 18 tons. Once launched, the pilot could not escape. No hatch opened from inside. The oxygen system would sustain him for approximately 6 hours, but he carried enough fuel for perhaps 90 minutes of high-speed running. The pilot entered through a hatch that was bolted shut from outside by the submarine crew. From that moment, his fate was sealed regardless of whether he found a target. Success meant instant vaporization in the explosion. Failure meant slow suffocation, as oxygen depleted or drowning when the torpedo ran out of fuel and sank. There was no provision for rescue, no hope of survival, no alternative to death. Training began at Otsushima Island in August 1944. Volunteers came forward in numbers that surprised even advocates of the program. Young officers and enlisted men, many barely out of their teens, requested assignment to Kaiten units with an eagerness that seemed incomprehensible to Western observers. American intelligence officers who later studied the program struggled to understand the psychology that made men volunteer for certain death. But Japanese military culture in 1944 operated under pressures that defy simple explanation. The volunteers came from a society that had embraced total war with religious fervor. Emperor Hirohito was considered divine, a living god whose will was absolute. To die in his service was the highest honor a Japanese subject could achieve. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, meant choosing honorable death over the shame of surrender or defeat. For young men raised in this culture, facing a war situation that was clearly hopeless, the Kaiten offered purpose. They would not die meaninglessly in some futile conventional attack. They would guide their weapon directly to its target with absolute certainty, achieving in death what Japan's remaining fleet could no longer accomplish in life. The training was brutally realistic. Early Kaiten prototypes killed 11 trainee pilots in accidents. The tiny cockpit was cramped, dark, and terrifying. Pilots practiced in training torpedoes that could be recovered, learning to navigate by periscope while maintaining depth control and calculating intercept courses. The mathematics were demanding. The pilot had to estimate target speed and bearing from brief periscope glimpses, then plot an intercept course while managing his own speed and depth. All this while lying prone or hunched in a space where he couldn't stand, couldn't stretch, couldn't move more than his arms and head. The psychological preparation was equally intense. Pilots wrote farewell letters to their families, letters that would be delivered only after confirmed death. They underwent ritual purification ceremonies. Many recorded final messages on phonograph discs, speaking to parents and siblings they would never see again. The tone of these recordings, preserved in Japanese archives, varies from resigned acceptance to genuine enthusiasm. Some pilots spoke of their sacrifice as inevitable duty. Others expressed genuine belief that their deaths would turn the war's tide. A few revealed doubt or fear, but always within the framework of accepting their fate as necessary. Lieutenant Sekio Nishina, one of the Kaiten's inventors, volunteered as a pilot himself. On November 8, 1944, 12 days before the attack on Ulithi, he was lost when his Kaiten malfunctioned during launch from submarine WW2. The weapon dove uncontrollably and imploded at excessive depth, killing Nishina instantly. His co-inventor Hiroshi Kuroki survived him by only 2 months, dying in a Kaiten attack on January 12, 1945. Both men achieved the deaths they had designed for others, a consistency of conviction that was both admirable and horrifying. The experience of piloting a Kaiten was documented by the few men who survived failed missions where mechanical problems forced launches to be aborted or where pilots were recovered during training. Their accounts describe an ordeal that combined physical discomfort, sensory deprivation, and psychological terror. The cockpit temperature could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in tropical waters. The oxygen-enriched atmosphere caused headaches and nausea. The constant vibration of the engine shook the entire structure. The pilot could see only what appeared in his tiny periscope for seconds at a time before he had to dive to avoid detection. Most of the mission was conducted blind, navigating by dead reckoning toward a target the pilot had glimpsed only briefly. The psychological impact of entombment while still alive cannot be overstated. Once the hatch was bolted, the pilot existed in a metal cylinder hurtling through black water toward certain death. No communication with the launching submarine was possible once the Kaiten separated. No rescue would come regardless of mechanical failure. If the torpedo systems malfunctioned, the pilot could only wait for death, either from suffocation, drowning, or implosion as the weapon sank beyond crush depth. Several training Kaitens were recovered after accidents with their pilots dead inside from suffocation, their bodies contorted from final desperate attempts to open hatches that had no interior mechanisms. For American sailors aboard ships targeted by Kaitens, the experience was equally terrifying, but for entirely different reasons. Unlike kamikaze aircraft that could be seen approaching and engaged by anti-aircraft fire, Kaiten attacks gave no warning. The weapons were nearly impossible to detect with the hydrophone technology of 1944. They ran just below the surface at speeds up to 40 knots, leaving almost no wake. The first indication of attack was the moment of impact, and by then survival depended entirely on location relative to the blast and whether the ship carried volatile cargo. The attack on USS Mississinewa demonstrated the weapon's potential. Ensign Takeo Yamaguchi piloted the Kaiten that sank her, launched from submarine 147, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita. Yamaguchi had been at sea for 6 hours when he sighted the American anchorage at dawn. Through his periscope, he observed what must have seemed like the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet, spread before him. Dozens of capital ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, and support vessels rested at anchor in neat rows. He could have selected almost any target, but he chose the oiler because its cargo of fuel and aviation gasoline would create the spectacular fireball that would demoralize the American fleet. The explosion validated his calculation. The blast was so intense that sailors on carriers and battleships 3 miles away believed their own ships were under attack. Damage control parties throughout the anchorage rushed to battle stations. Destroyers charged through the anchorage at flank speed searching for the attacker, but Yamaguchi was already dead. vaporized in the explosion he had spent 6 months training to deliver. His body was never recovered. Nothing larger than fragments remained of his Kaiten. But 63 American sailors died with him, and the psychological impact spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, ordered an immediate investigation. How had a Japanese weapon penetrated Ulithi's defenses? Were more attacks coming? Most critically, what was this weapon, and how could it be countered? Intelligence analysts scrambled to understand what had killed the Mississinewa. Initial theories proposed a midget submarine, similar to those used at Pearl Harbor. But wreckage recovered from the lagoon showed something different: fragments of what appeared to be a torpedo modified for human occupancy. The revelation shocked American commanders. Japan had deployed kamikaze aircraft 2 months earlier during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but those could be explained as desperate pilots deliberately crashing damaged planes into ships. This was different. This was a weapon purpose-built for suicide, a torpedo with a cockpit. Intelligence officers struggled to comprehend the mentality that would design such a weapon and the culture that would produce volunteers to pilot it. American military psychiatrists were consulted to assess whether captured Kaiten pilots would provide intelligence or whether their fanaticism would make interrogation impossible. The program was expanding rapidly in Japan. By December 1944, the Kaiten training base at Otsushima had over 100 pilots in various stages of preparation. Production facilities were manufacturing Kaitens at a rate that would eventually reach 300 units before the war's end. 4 different models were developed. The Type 1, used at Ulithi, was the basic production version. The Type 2 attempted to address the entombment problem by mounting a detachable cockpit on the torpedo's exterior, allowing the pilot to separate and be recovered if the attack failed. The Type 4 used hydrogen peroxide fuel for greater speed and range. None of these variants solved the fundamental problem that the weapon's effective use required the pilot's death. Submarine commanders who carried Kaitens reported mixed feelings about the weapons. The Kaitens were mounted on deck, typically 3 to 6 per submarine, requiring extensive modifications to hulls and pressure systems. Loading and launching procedures were complex and dangerous, requiring the submarine to surface in hostile waters while crew members unsealed hatches and helped pilots enter their weapons. Once launched, the parent submarine had to clear the area immediately to avoid detection, leaving the Kaiten pilots to attack independently, with no support or coordination. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, who commanded I-47 during the Ulithi attack, later wrote about the emotional burden of sending young men to certain death. In his post-war memoir, he described the final moments before launch, when pilots would salute through the Kaiten's small window and shout final banzai before the hatches were bolted. Orita wrote that he felt like an executioner rather than a commander, though he believed the missions were necessary for Japan's survival. His submarine conducted 4 Kaiten missions before the war ended, launching 23 weapons. Only 1 confirmed sinking resulted, the Mississinewa, though Japanese records claimed additional hits that American records do not confirm. The discrepancy between Japanese claims and American losses reveals the Kaiten's fundamental weakness. Despite their pilots' willingness to die, despite perfect guidance by human operators, despite the terror they inspired, Kaitens sank only 2 confirmed American vessels, the Mississinewa and the destroyer escort USS Underhill, sunk on July 24, 1945, with the loss of 112 crewmen. Japanese records claim as many as 15 ships sunk and numerous others damaged, but American loss records document only these 2 sinkings directly attributable to Kaiten attacks. The reasons for this failure rate illuminate the weapon's fundamental flaws. Navigation by periscope was extraordinarily difficult. The pilot could raise the periscope for only seconds at a time before needing to dive to avoid detection. In those brief glimpses, he had to identify his target, estimate its course and speed, and calculate an intercept bearing. Any error in these calculations, any change in target speed or course, and the Kaiten would miss. The pilots had no way to correct their course once committed to an attack run. Unlike guided missiles with course correction, unlike aircraft that could adjust their dive, the Kaiten pilot made his final calculations and then drove his weapon in a straight line toward where he believed his target would be. The second major problem was target defenses. After Ulithi, American forces implemented aggressive anti-Kaiten measures. Destroyer patrols around anchorages were increased. Ships at anchor posted continuous lookouts, specifically watching for periscope wakes. Most effectively, American submarines and patrol aircraft hunted the Japanese submarines carrying Kaitens, sinking several before they could launch their weapons. I-36, which participated in the Ulithi attack, was sunk by destroyer escort USS Conklin on March 1, 1945. I-37, which also attacked Ulithi, was sunk by destroyer escorts USS McCoy Reynolds and USS Conklin on November 19, 1944, the day before the attack. The human cost was staggering. Of approximately 100 Kaiten pilots who deployed on operational missions, at least 80 died. Some perished when their parent submarines were sunk before launching. Others died in their weapons from mechanical failures, suffocation, or simply missing their targets and running out of fuel far from any rescue. A few were killed when their Kaitens were destroyed by American defensive fire. Only a handful survived the war, men whose missions were aborted due to mechanical problems or whose submarines were recalled before launch. The psychological impact on American forces extended beyond the casualties inflicted. The knowledge that Japan was deploying suicide weapons as a matter of policy rather than desperation created a profound sense that the enemy had moved beyond rational warfare into something approaching fanaticism. American intelligence assessments concluded that Japan would fight to literally the last man, that invasion of the home islands would require killing every Japanese soldier and perhaps much of the civilian population. The Kaiten program seemed to confirm the worst fears about Japanese willingness to sacrifice lives rather than accept defeat. This perception influenced American planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. Military planners estimated that Japan might have hundreds of Kaitens positioned in harbors and anchorages around the home islands, ready to attack the invasion fleet. Combined with thousands of kamikaze aircraft and suicide boats, the human torpedo force could potentially inflict catastrophic casualties on ships crowded into confined waters during the landing operations. These calculations contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons rather than proceed with invasion, though the Kaiten threat was far from the primary factor in that decision. Japanese production records show that nearly 400 Kaitens were completed before the war ended, with plans for thousands more. Training continued until August 1945, with new volunteer pilots arriving at Otsushima, even as Japan's situation became hopeless. Some of these pilots never deployed because their submarines were sunk, or because the war ended before they could be assigned to missions. Others were positioned at bases throughout the home islands, waiting for the American invasion that never came. The attack on USS Underhill on July 24, 1945, demonstrated that Kaitens remained dangerous until the war's end. The destroyer escort was operating east of the Philippines when torpedoes were sighted approaching. The ship maneuvered to avoid them, but one weapon, almost certainly a Kaiten, though some accounts suggest a conventional torpedo, struck the ship's magazine. The resulting explosion broke Underhill in half. The forward section sank in less than 5 minutes. The stern section remained afloat long enough for some survivors to escape, but 112 men died out of a crew of 238. Survivors reported seeing what appeared to be a small conning tower or periscope immediately before impact, suggesting a Kaiten rather than a standard torpedo. After the war, Allied investigators documented the Kaiten program in detail. Interrogation of surviving pilots, examination of captured weapons, and review of Japanese naval records provided a complete picture of the program's development and deployment. American analysts were particularly interested in the volunteers' psychological profiles. How had Japan convinced over 100 men to volunteer for certain death? Were they coerced? Were they fanatical believers in imperial ideology? Or were they simply young men trapped in a society that offered them no alternative to military service and no hope of survival in conventional roles? The interrogations revealed complex motivations. Some pilots expressed genuine belief that their sacrifice would enable Japan to achieve a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. Others spoke of family honor and the shame that would attach to relatives of men who refused to serve in Japan's greatest crisis. A few admitted fear and doubt, but emphasized that refusing would have been impossible given social pressures and military discipline. Almost none expressed regret for volunteering, though several questioned whether the program had been worth the lives spent. Their testimony provided insights into a military culture that Western observers still struggle to fully understand. The technical examination of captured Kaitens revealed both impressive engineering and tragic design flaws. The oxygen-enriched propulsion system represented advanced technology for 1944, providing greater range and speed than conventional torpedoes. The stabilization and depth control systems showed sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics, but the life support systems were crude, providing barely adequate oxygen and no provisions for carbon dioxide scrubbing beyond basic chemical absorption. The cockpit design showed no consideration for pilot comfort or long-duration operation. The control interfaces were awkward and difficult to operate in the cramped space. Most damningly, no escape mechanism existed even in theory. The weapon was designed from the beginning as a one-way journey. Modern naval historians debate the Kaiten's effectiveness and its place in the broader context of Japanese suicide tactics. Some argue that the weapon's minimal success rate proved that even willing sacrifice cannot overcome technical and tactical limitations. The two confirmed sinkings represented perhaps 2% of deployed weapons, a failure rate that would have led to any conventional weapon's immediate cancellation. Others suggest that the psychological impact and the defensive resources diverted to counter the Kaiten threat exceeded the actual damage inflicted, making the program strategically significant despite its tactical failures. What cannot be debated is the human tragedy the program represents. Over 100 young men died in Kaiten cockpits, most achieving nothing beyond their own deaths. The two successful attacks killed 175 American sailors, men whose deaths served no strategic purpose in a war Japan had already lost.